Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, across thousands of years of human civilization, counting the dead has taken many different forms, but none quite as deliberate, as exacting, or as strange as this one. If you had to design a system to prove precisely how many enemies had fallen, a system that left a physical record that could never be disputed, what would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a number inscribed in limestone on the interior wall of a temple that has been standing since approximately 1457 BC. The number is 410. The inscription is located within the temple complex at Karnak, in the chamber that scholars call the Annals of Thutmose III, and it faces inward toward the sanctuary of the god Amun. What the number represents is not disputed by anyone who has studied it. What it required, the chain of decisions, procedures, logistics, and physical acts that had to occur before that number could be verified and committed to permanent stone, is something the inscription does not explain. No explanation was considered necessary. Everyone who read it, in the world that produced it, already understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it had taken to produce it. They had grown up inside the system. The system did not need to describe itself to its own participants. That is where this account begins. Not with a campaign, not with an army, a king, a chariot, or a distant walled city under siege, but with a number, and with the question of what had to happen in a field far from Egypt, under a Levantine sun, before that number could be made to exist. The reign of Thutmose III, the pharaoh whose scribes composed the inscription in question, is placed by modern scholarship across approximately 54 years, from around 1479 BC to 1425 BC. He ruled during what Egyptologists classify as the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom period, the phase of Egyptian history in which the state reached its broadest territorial extent and its most elaborate administrative and institutional development. The New Kingdom was not simply a continuation of the political structures that had preceded it. It was a transformation of them. The administrative apparatus that the New Kingdom developed, its military organization, its scribal bureaucracy, its temple economy, its systems of tribute extraction and redistribution, was more sophisticated, more far-reaching, and more self-consciously documented than anything the Nile Valley had previously produced. The 18th dynasty stood near the beginning of that transformation, and Thutmose III was, within it, the ruler whose military campaigns pushed the experiment of Egyptian imperial reach to its furthest expression. The capital during much of his reign was Thebes, situated along the eastern bank of the Nile in the south of Egypt, a city whose physical remains, temples, administrative structures, granaries, workshops, the vast necropolis spread across the cliffs and valleys of the western bank, still dominate the landscape of the region now called Luxor. Thebes was not simply a political capital. It was the religious center of the state, the home of Amun, the deity whose cult had grown from a relatively local Theban tradition into the dominant theological framework of Egyptian imperial ideology. Amun was identified with a divine force that underwrote the pharaoh's authority and legitimized his campaigns. The pharaoh fought because Amun had directed him to fight. The pharaoh conquered because Amun had guaranteed the outcome. The tribute that flowed back to Egypt from the territories of Ret Jenu, the gold, the cedar wood, the horses, the captives, was understood not merely as the spoils of military competence, but as the material expression of divine favor. It was what Amun had promised, and what the campaigns delivered. The Temple of Karnak, within which the annals are inscribed, was the primary sanctuary of Amun in Thebes, and it was, even in the period of Thutmose III, already ancient. Construction on the site had begun during the Middle Kingdom period, more than 500 years before his birth, under pharaohs whose names were themselves distant history to the scribes of the 18th dynasty. By the time those scribes were cutting the annals into the limestone walls of the festival hall that Thutmose III himself had commissioned, the temple complex at Karnak had already accumulated centuries of additions, reconstructions, and elaborations. The festival hall, the Ak menu, a structure whose name translates roughly as the most splendid of monuments, was positioned behind the earlier sanctuary structures, deeper into the complex, further from the public processional spaces, and closer to the inner sanctums, where the cult statue of Amun was housed and tended. The annals were inscribed in this interior space. They were not placed where visitors or suppliants might casually encounter them. They were placed where the god could witness them. Thutmose III conducted 17 military campaigns into the territories north and east of Egypt over the course of his reign. The Egyptians referred to this broader region by the name Retjenu, a term applied generally to the Levant and the areas of the eastern Mediterranean littoral that are now covered by the modern states of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Jordan. The campaigns varied in scale, objective, and documented outcome. Some were punitive expeditions responding to shifts in the loyalty of vassal city-states. Some were extended operations aimed at consolidating control over key trade and tribute routes. Some moved into territories that had not previously been within Egypt's administrative reach. The first campaign, the one that encompassed the engagement near the city of Megiddo and that produced, among other tallied outcomes, the number 410, was the most extensively documented and has received the most sustained scholarly attention of any of the 17. The records of these campaigns were inscribed into the walls of the Karnak complex, over a period of years, campaign by campaign, accumulating into the text that modern Egyptologists call the Annals. They represent one of the most detailed surviving military administrative documents from the ancient world. They are not complete sections or damaged beyond legibility. Others appear to have been abbreviated or summarized rather than fully recorded, and the relationship between the surviving inscription and the original field records from which it was derived is a matter of ongoing scholarly analysis. They are not impartial. They were composed under royal supervision, oriented explicitly toward the glorification of the pharaoh and the demonstration of divine favor upon his campaigns. A number recorded in a text of this kind is a number that has already been through the filter of royal approval. It has been deemed appropriate for permanent inscription in the house of the god. But the operational specificity of the content, the precision of the numbers, the naming of places and peoples, the enumeration of specific categories of tribute and captive carries a texture that is recognizably administrative rather than purely rhetorical. Someone was counting. Someone was writing the counts down in the field. Someone later transferred those counts to the stone. The chain from event to inscription was bureaucratic, and within that bureaucracy, the severing and counting of right hands occupied a defined and formally recognized role. The practice itself was not invented by Thutmose III, and this must be established plainly because misattribution distorts both the historical record and the significance of the practice. The oldest surviving visual documentation of the hand-counting process in an Egyptian military context comes not from the New Kingdom at all, but from reliefs produced during the reign of Ramesses III, who ruled during the 20th dynasty, approximately 3 centuries after Thutmose III closed his reign. The reliefs at Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile opposite modern Luxor, depict the process with a compositional specificity that communicates immediately and unmistakably the quality of long institutional familiarity. These are not images of a practice being invented or improvised. The figures performing the collection move through the carved scene without hesitation or ambiguity. The scribe who receives the tally sits at a slight and deliberate remove from the collected objects, his writing palette across his knee, in a posture that is bureaucratic to its core. The soldiers delivering the hands are in postures that encode an established handover protocol. This is how a soldier stands when delivering a verified count to an administrative official within a system that both of them have been trained in. The king who oversees the accounting is positioned above both, in the formal elevated stance of a pharaoh receiving a report that confirms what was already expected. Nothing in the scene reads as improvised or experimental. The procedure has a grammar. It has established roles. established spatial relationships, established expectations about what will be delivered and how it will be received. It has been done many times before these particular images were carved. Earlier textual evidence, fragmentary as it survives in the archaeological record, places the practice as operational at least by the beginning of the New Kingdom period, and possibly before it. Whether the practice predates the New Kingdom entirely, whether it reaches back into the Middle Kingdom, into the period of the Old Kingdom, into the formative centuries of the Egyptian state, is a question that the excavated record has not yet resolved. The evidence becomes thinner the further back one goes, and thin evidence cannot support confident claims in either direction. What can be said with confidence is that by the time the scribes of Thutmose III were composing the Annals at Karnak, the procedure was sufficiently established that it required no explanation within the inscription itself. It was an entry in a list. It sat in the tally alongside the count of chariots captured 924, and the count of horses 2,038, and the count of prisoners taken alive 2,238. The hands appeared in the same grammatical structure as the chariots, with the same scribal brevity, carrying no annotation distinguishing them from any other category of inventoried outcome. They were inventory. They were a deliverable within an administrative system that had a place for them and expected them to arrive. To understand why the right hand specifically, rather than any other anatomical unit that would have served the counting function with equal efficiency, was chosen as the object of collection, it is necessary to move away from the purely military framing and toward the symbolic architecture within which Egyptian administrative and religious practice operated, because those two domains were not, in the Egyptian world, distinct. They were not separate spheres that occasionally intersected in interesting ways. They were aspects of a single coherent reality, organized according to a unified underlying logic. The scribes who counted hands at a military campaign's end were the same class of men who administered the accounting of temple grain offerings. The soldiers who performed the severing were the same men who participated in the state's elaborate ceremonial life, who understood the language of offering and ritual and the correct behavior in the presence of the sacred. The king who received the final tally was simultaneously the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus, the earthly custodian of Maat, the cosmic principle of order, truth, and balance that underwrote the entire structure of Egyptian civilization, and the chief intermediary between the human world and the divine order that sustained it. These were not separate roles that one person happened to hold. They were one role, understood as a unity. Within that unified framework, the right hand carried a specific and well-documented symbolic weight that the left hand did not. In Egyptian symbolic language, it was consistently and persistently associated with active agency, with the direction of deliberate force outward into the world, with the initiation of consequential action. This association was not incidental or confined to a single text or tradition. It appears across multiple distinct categories of Egyptian cultural production. The hieroglyphic writing system included determinative signs, classificatory symbols that clarified meaning by associating a word with a visual category that used the image of an arm and hand extended in action. Ritual offering texts, of which a substantial number survive from the New Kingdom period, frequently specified that the right hand was the hand of presentation, the hand through which an offering was correctly extended toward a deity. Temple relief programs, which covered the interior and exterior walls of Egyptian sacred architecture with images that encoded theological meaning in visual form, depict the presentation of offerings and the performance of ritual actions with that hand as the active agent with overwhelming consistency. The chosen object was not, within this symbolic system, simply a convenient anatomical unit that happened to be unique to each individual body. It was the precise locus of the enemy combatant's capacity to direct hostile force into the world, the part that had gripped the weapon, the part that had swung it, the part through which dangerous agency had been expressed and extended against the order that Egypt embodied and the God who guaranteed and sustained that order. Removing it was not, therefore, solely or even primarily a counting exercise, however efficiently it served that function. it was an annulment. It was the physical, permanent cancellation of a specific dangerous agency. That cancellation was irreversible. And within the cosmological logic of the Egyptian world, a logic that did not draw sharp boundaries between the material and the symbolic, between the act and its meaning, that cancellation had weight in a register that extended beyond the practical outcome of producing one countable object per fallen enemy. The hand was removed because removing it did something, accomplished something, in a domain that overlapped with but was not reducible to military accounting. And what it accomplished in that domain was then recorded permanently in a temple facing a god, in a stone inscription that was designed from the outset to outlast the civilization that had commissioned it. That interpretation is not stated explicitly anywhere in the Annals. Egyptian administrative texts rarely explain their own symbolic logic, for the same reason that a contemporary legal document does not include a philosophical explanation of why signatures create binding obligation. The logic is assumed. The framework is shared among all participants in the system, and shared frameworks do not require articulation to the people who already inhabit them. But the convergence of the right hand's symbolic significance across offering ritual, determinative writing, royal presentation imagery, and the specific practice of military accounting makes it very difficult, under sustained scholarly scrutiny, to treat the choice of the right hand as arbitrary or as a purely practical decision made for anatomical convenience. The left hand would have served the counting function with identical efficiency. One left hand per fallen soldier, one left hand per counted death, one unique identifier per body. The system's logic would have been unchanged. The choice of the right hand was made for reasons that operated within the symbolic architecture of the civilization, not outside it. And in a civilization that understood the symbolic and the material as aspects of a single reality, those reasons were as real and as consequential as any practical consideration. The process of collection itself, reconstructed from the combination of the Annals textual record, the visual record preserved at Medinet Habu, and the comparative analysis of analogous practices documented in other contemporary Near Eastern cultures, proceeded through a sequence of defined operational stages. After the conclusion of active engagement, after the armies had separated, the pursuit had ended, and the field had arrived at the particular stillness that follows extreme violence units of soldiers moved through the bodies of fallen enemies. The field where an engagement of this scale had taken place would have been a specific sensory environment. The ground would have been thoroughly disturbed, churned and compacted by the movement of thousands of feet and the wheels of hundreds of chariots. The pale, limestone-rich dust of the Levantine terrain displaced into the air and resettled on every surface. The air itself would have carried a quality of stillness that is distinct from ordinary quiet, the stillness that exists in spaces where extreme sound has recently been, a residual silence that is felt as much as heard. The sun in the Levant in late spring, when the first campaign's engagement near Megiddo is generally dated by scholars working on the Annals' internal chronology, would have been direct and heavy, falling on pale, disturbed ground with no relief. The combination of heat, dust, and the absolute flatness of the Jezreel Valley's central plain would have produced a harsh, exposed environment for the work that followed the engagement. The soldiers who performed the collection were not, as far as any surviving textual or visual record indicates, a specialized caste or a designated unit set apart from the general army specifically for this purpose. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict ordinary soldiers, identifiable by their standard military attire and equipment, in the role of collector and transporter. They were fighting men assigned to a post-engagement task, equipped with the standard cutting implements of the Egyptian military of the mid-2nd millennium BC, bronze-bladed weapons of various forms, since iron had not yet displaced bronze as the primary material for military and utilitarian cutting tools in Egypt or the broader Eastern Mediterranean world during this period. The wrist joint presents a natural anatomical point of separation when approached with a blade directed correctly through the joint space between the carpal bones and the radius. It does not require the same force as cutting through dense bone. A soldier familiar with edged weapons and with the general anatomical reality of human bodies, which any professional soldier of this era would have been, would have understood the mechanics without instruction. The task, performed systematically and repeatedly across a field of fallen men, was a matter of method rather than skill. It required moving through the field in a spatial pattern, area by area, section by section, to avoid confusion in the count, to ensure that no body was visited twice and no body was missed. It required sustained attention in conditions of heat and physical aftermath. It required time. The field near Megiddo, given the scale of the coalition force that the Annals describe as having assembled there, would not have been a small field to work. The hands were then collected and transported to the accounting point, where the scribal official maintained his position. The mechanism of transport, the baskets, carrying cloths, net structures, or other containers used to convey the collected objects, is not specified in any surviving text, and the Medinet Habu reliefs do not depict the transport phase in detail. What they depict is the arrival and the accounting, the hands in organized groupings, the scribe at his deliberate remove, the soldiers in the established posture of delivery. The spatial organization of the scene at Medinet Habu is worth attention in its own right. The scribe is not positioned among the objects being counted. He is not immediately adjacent to them. He is at a distance that is compositionally and functionally specific, close enough to direct the count, clearly enough positioned to be recognized as the institutional authority receiving the deliverable, but separated from the objects themselves by a gap that encodes a distinction. The collector is not the counter. The counter is not the recorder. The recorder is not the king who receives the final number. Each stage of the process is handled by a different participant, occupying a different structural position within the system. This is not an accident of composition. It is the visual representation of a bureaucratic logic that kept different functions structurally separate. The count, once completed, was recorded on papyrus by the field scribes working within or near the army's operational zone in the Levant. These papyrus field records were the source documents from which the permanent stone inscription was later composed at Karnak. The relationship between the field record and the temple inscription was not a simple one-to-one transfer. Scholars who have studied the Annals in close textual and paleographic detail have identified compositional signs in the earliest campaign records, including those from the first campaign, that are consistent with the inscription having been derived from shorter, contemporaneous source documents rather than composed from memory or general recollection after the fact. The grammatical structures of certain passages, the handling of specific numerical data, and subtle variations in the scribal hand across different sections of the inscription all suggest a text that was assembled from primary sources rather than composed whole. Someone was writing these numbers down close to the events that produced them, in the Levant, under field conditions, on perishable material. The limestone at Karnak is the end point of a document chain that began in a field. Neither end of that chain survives complete. What has survived is the stone. What has been lost is everything that produced it. What happened to the hands themselves after the count was complete and the number had been extracted from them is a question that the entire surviving record, the Annals, the Medinet Habu reliefs, every surviving administrative text from the New Kingdom military apparatus does not answer. This silence deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives, because Egyptian administrative culture was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily thorough in its documentation of procedural and logistical matters. The New Kingdom administrative papyri that have survived in sufficient quantity to be analyzed as a body of material include records for the disposition of worn sandals removed from palace storage. They include inventories of broken ceramic vessels from temple workshops, noting how many were broken, when, and what was done with the fragments. They include protocols for the handling of objects categorized as ritually impure, specifying in precise terms what procedures were required before such objects could be moved through sacred spaces, transferred between administrative domains, or disposed of in a manner that would not compromise the ritual status of the spaces they passed through. The administrative apparatus of the New Kingdom left records of things that modern observers would not have thought worth recording. And yet nowhere in the surviving record, not in the Annals, not in the military administrative papyri, not in any temple inventory or disposal protocol yet recovered, does there appear a specification for what was to be done with severed human hands once the scribal count had been completed and the number had been committed to the field papyrus. 3 interpretive positions exist within the scholarship that has engaged with this gap, and they lead to very different understandings of what the practice actually was. The first holds that the hands, once counted, reverted immediately to the category of battlefield debris, that having served their administrative purpose, they required no further procedural attention, no more ritual consideration than a broken axle or an abandoned sandal, and were left on or near the field where they had been collected. On this reading, the silence in the record is simply the silence that surrounds all battlefield debris. The record keepers did not record what was not considered worth recording, and discarded organic material from a military engagement was not. The second interpretive position holds that the hands were buried, likely in proximity to the general treatment of enemy dead, a category about which Egyptian records are also, tellingly, largely silent. The enemy dead of Egyptian campaigns do not appear in the administrative record as a logistical concern. What was done with thousands of fallen soldiers in the fields of Retjenu after each campaign is not specified. Whether they were buried by Egyptian forces, left for local populations to manage, or left entirely, the record does not say. The hands, on this reading, were managed as part of that general and undocumented category. The third interpretive position is the most difficult to dismiss and the least frequently cited in popular treatments of this subject. It holds that the hands were incorporated into a post-campaign ritual of presentation or offering before their final disposal, that the disposal itself occurred within a religious ceremony whose records were maintained in temple, archives separate from the military annals, archives that did not survive the various disruptions and destructions that have depleted the Egyptian record over 3 millennia. This interpretation rests on a specific structural feature of the Karnak inscription itself that has not been given adequate attention in the standard accounts. In certain registers of the Annals, the accounting of hands and prisoners is immediately followed in the document's sequence by a passage describing the formal ritual presentation of the campaign's results before Amun. In this presentation passage, Thutmose III, acting simultaneously as king and as divine intermediary, renders the outcome of the campaign to the god in a formulaic declaration. The passage enumerates captives, livestock, quantities of precious materials, and tribute. The hands are not named within the presentation passage itself, but they appear in the inscription sequence immediately before it, separated from it by a compositional transition that is formal and deliberate rather than casual or incidental. The question of whether that sequential relationship encodes a temporal one, whether the presentation of the counted hands to the scribal official was understood to be a preliminary to some form of presentation before the god, is a question that the translation of the text cannot resolve with certainty. But it is a question that the text structure raises, and that the structure of Egyptian ritual logic makes it genuinely difficult to set aside. The religious dimension of the practice becomes still more visible when the Egyptian case is placed within the broader Near Eastern context in which the Egyptian military operated. The Egyptian army of the New Kingdom was not moving through a cultural vacuum when it campaigned in Retjenu. The territories it entered were inhabited by populations with their own developed administrative traditions, their own religious frameworks, and their own practices for managing the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The armies that faced each other in the Jezreel Valley and the mountain passes of the Carmel Ridge were not products of wholly alien cosmologies. They shared a broader Eastern Mediterranean world in which the symbolic weight of dead bodies and of specific parts of dead bodies was widely and seriously understood. In Assyrian military reliefs produced in the 9th and 8th centuries BC, more than 500 years after the close of Thutmose III's reign, but representative of practices that had their own long antecedents, the accounting of enemy dead employs decapitation rather than the severing of hands, but the administrative and symbolic logic is structurally identical. A body part is removed from the fallen enemy. It is collected and organized. It is counted by a designated official. The king receives the number. In the Hebrew Bible, in the first book of Samuel, the narrative of a young man asked to prove his military worth describes the collection and presentation of foreskins from 200 Philistine dead, a quantified toll of enemy bodies expressed in anatomical terms, embedded in a social transaction that carries simultaneously administrative and ritual and political meaning. The brevity and specificity of the number, not approximately 200, but exactly 200, double the amount that had been requested, suggests a formal accounting process behind the claim. In the tradition that produced the Iliad, which reflects, however indirectly, a Bronze Age Mediterranean cultural world contemporary with the later New Kingdom, the stripping of armor and weapons from fallen enemies serves a partially parallel function. The removal of something significant from the body of the dead opponent as simultaneously practical acquisition, proof of killing, and an act that carries weight in a symbolic register that the narrative treats as real and consequential. What distinguishes the Egyptian case from these parallels with particular sharpness is the degree to which the practice had been formalized at the administrative and institutional level. It was emphatically not trophy-taking by individual soldiers acting on personal impulse or personal desire for commemoration. It was not a spontaneous, collective expression of victory. It was a managed, sequenced, multi-stage process with clearly designated roles at each stage: the collectors who moved through the field, the transporters who carried the objects to the accounting point, the scribal counter who maintained the tally, the recording scribe who committed the count to field papyrus, the scribal official at Karnak who incorporated the count into the permanent temple inscription. That degree of institutional formalization, the creation and maintenance of a specific bureaucratic infrastructure to support a single post-engagement accounting task, is a development that requires time. It is not designed from scratch for each campaign. It accumulates. It becomes refined through repetition. The scribal position at the accounting point of a pile of severed hands is not created for something new. It exists because it has been necessary before and will be necessary again, and the institution that created it understood that necessity as ongoing. The reliability of the hand count, as a military metric, rested on a foundational assumption that was elegant in its logic and vulnerable in its application. Each right hand corresponded to exactly one death. Each fallen soldier possessed exactly one. The system's efficiency derived from this biological uniqueness. A soldier could not contribute more than one to the count, and therefore the total could not, in theory, be artificially inflated by the actions of a single collector. The vulnerability of the system was that its integrity depended entirely on the attentiveness and honesty of the collectors working under field conditions. A body found already without it, whether through the action of another collector, through a wound sustained during the engagement, or through other causes, might still be counted if a collector assumed it had already been processed. A severed part found separated from its body by the chaos of the engagement itself might be counted independently. Wounded men who survived the engagement and withdrew from the field, or who were captured as prisoners, would presumably not have their hands collected. But the line between a fallen enemy and an incapacitated one was not always clear in the immediate aftermath of a large engagement. Men who fell beyond the operational range of the collecting teams, in areas that the soldiers did not reach before nightfall or before the army moved on, might not be represented in the count at all. Whether the number 410 reflected the actual toll with documentary precision, or whether it reflected the toll as filtered through the practical limitations and the institutional culture of the accounting process, is a question that cannot be answered from the surviving record. What the record preserves is not the truth of the toll. It preserves the institutional product of the procedure that was designed to determine it. Those two things were not necessarily identical, and yet the number was presented, accepted, incorporated into the permanent inscription, and placed before the god without qualification or caveat. Its accuracy was confirmed, within the logic of the system, by the fact of its proper presentation. There exists within the documentary record associated with the first campaign a specific numerical anomaly that has received insufficient attention in the popular accounts of this practice and insufficient resolution in the specialized scholarship. The Annals record 410 hands in the military accounting passage. A secondary inscription at Karnak, a dedicatory text associated with the ritual rendering of the campaign's results before a moon, a document functionally related to, but formally distinct from, the Annals proper, contains a passage that has been translated by more than one Egyptologist working independently as a reference to the enemy dead from the same campaign, with a figure that does not correspond to 410. The discrepancy between the two figures is not enormous in absolute terms, and the secondary text reading is contested because the relevant section of that inscription is damaged and its translation requires interpretive choices about which reasonable scholars have differed. But if the secondary text is read as referencing the same event, the same enemy dead, and the same counting procedure, then two different numbers exist in the permanent stone record of what should have been a single count performed on a single field on a single occasion. Scribal error is the simplest explanation and cannot be ruled out. The translation of field papyrus to temple stone was a process performed by human scribes working under conditions that were not always ideal, and copying errors in Egyptian administrative texts are not unknown. A second explanation holds that the two texts are referencing different things, different moments in the campaign, different categories of the dead, different accounting categories, that a shared term covers differently in different textual contexts. But the third explanation is the one that becomes most difficult to dismiss when the religious orientation of the Annals is taken seriously as a fact about what kind of document these inscriptions are. On this reading, the two numbers were not intended to be the same number, because they were not intended to serve the same function. The figure in the military accounting passage was the operational count, verified, recorded in the field, transferred to stone, intended as the administrative record of what the collection procedure had produced. The figure in the dedicatory passage was a ritual number, embedded in a formal declaration made before the god, constructed according to the conventions of dedicatory religious inscription, and carrying symbolic or cosmological weight that operated according to rules that were not the same rules as documentary accuracy. Egyptian religious and ritual texts use numbers in ways that are not always or even frequently intended as literal quantitative statements. Certain numbers within the symbolic vocabulary of Egyptian religious writing carry specific and well-documented associations that make them appropriate for use in particular ritual contexts, regardless of whether they correspond to an empirical count. The number 4 and its multiples are associated across multiple textual traditions with totality, completeness, and the 4 cardinal directions that bounded and defined the ordered world. The number 7 appears in certain funerary and ritual contexts as a marker of completion or fullness. Large round numbers 100, 1,000, 100,000 function in some dedicatory and hymnic texts as intensifiers or as symbolic representations of categorical fullness rather than as precise enumerations. Whether either of the numbers associated with the hand count from the first campaign carried any such symbolic loading, whether the number in the military accounting passage was a genuine empirical count and the number in the dedicatory passage was a ritual figure constructed according to a different logic, is a question that the current state of the scholarship cannot resolve with certainty. It cannot be resolved in the affirmative. It also cannot be resolved in the negative, because the scribes who composed and inscribed both passages were simultaneously administrative officials operating within a military bureaucracy and priestly officials operating within a temple dedicated to a god. They worked in both registers simultaneously. The distinction between a number as empirical documentation and a number as ritual declaration may not have been, for them, the sharp and stable distinction that it appears to modern observers trained to keep those categories separate. The physical act of severing and its relationship to the bodies of the fallen enemies brings the practice into contact with a body of Egyptian belief that the administrative record rarely addresses directly, but that pervaded every aspect of Egyptian cultural life. Egyptian funerary theology, one of the most elaborated and internally consistent theological systems produced by any ancient civilization, placed an extraordinary and foundational emphasis on the physical integrity of the body as a precondition for a stable and complete afterlife. The elaborate mortuary practices of the Egyptian New Kingdom mummification as a complex multi-stage process of organ removal and preservation, chemical desiccation, material wrapping, the placement of protective amulets at specific anatomical locations, the recitation of protective and enabling texts at each stage, the construction of a sealed and physically protected burial environment were all oriented toward a single fundamental goal. That goal was the preservation of the physical body in a form coherent enough that the various spiritual components of the person, which Egyptian theology distinguished in sophisticated and not always consistent terms, could continue to inhabit it, animate it, and be sustained by it across the indefinite duration of the afterlife. The body was the anchor. The body was the physical address to which the spiritual self returned. Without a body, or without a body that retained sufficient physical coherence to be inhabited and animated, the conditions necessary for the standard Egyptian afterlife, the existence in the realm of the dead that mirrored and continued the life of the living, were fundamentally compromised. This belief applied without question to Egyptians. The mortuary literature, the tomb inscriptions, the funerary amulets, the mummification protocols, all of this was developed and maintained for the benefit of Egyptian dead. Whether it was understood to apply to the enemies of Egypt, to the soldiers of the Kadesh coalition who fell in the Jezreel Valley, to the Canaanite and Syrian warriors who had assembled under their king's banner against the Egyptian advance, is a question that the Egyptian textual record does not address directly. The cosmological framework within which the Annals operate define the enemies of Egypt in specific theological terms. They were associated with the forces opposed to Ma'at, the divine order. They were aligned, in the symbolic vocabulary of Egyptian state theology, with the chaotic and destructive forces that the pharaoh's role was to hold at bay. Within that framework, the question of whether enemy dead had afterlife concerns that were worthy of Egyptian consideration was not one that the inscriptions found it necessary to raise. The enemies of order, within the system that defined them as such, were already outside the circle of beings whose well-being constituted a claim on Egyptian attention. But the possibility remains, and it is a possibility, that the convergence of Egyptian symbolic logic and the specific choice of the right hand makes difficult to entirely set aside that the removal of the right hand was understood within the cosmological framework of those who ordered and performed it to carry consequences for the dead enemy that extended beyond the logistical. If the body's integrity mattered for the afterlife of the living, and if the agents of the pharaoh understood that the same principle operated across the boundary between the ordered and the disordered, between Egyptian and enemy, then the removal of the right hand was not solely an act performed for the benefit of the Egyptian administrative record. It was an act that reached into the afterlife of the fallen enemy and removed from him, permanently and irreversibly, the physical instrument of his agency. It annulled him in death, as the engagement had annulled him in life. And it did so in a register that was not visible in the field, but was visible in the inscription at Karnak, in the sanctuary of the god who had ordered and guaranteed the campaign, where the permanent record of what had been done stood as testimony for as long as the stone stood. The study of the Annals as a text, their translation, their interpretation, the analysis of their relationship to other surviving documents from the New Kingdom period began in systematic form in the decades following the decipherment of hieroglyphic script in the early 19th century. Jean-François Champollion, the French linguist and archaeologist whose work was central to that decipherment, visited the Karnak complex during his Egyptian expedition in the 1820s and produced documentation of the inscriptions he encountered there. The Annals were known to European scholarship from this period, though their full analysis required further advances in the understanding of New Kingdom Egyptian vocabulary and grammar. The most comprehensive early treatment of the Annals in a Western scholarly language was produced by James Henry Breasted, the American Egyptologist whose multi-volume work, Ancient Records of Egypt, published in the early years of the 1900s, presented the first systematic English translation and annotation of the full surviving text. Breasted's translations have been revised in specific passages by subsequent scholarship as understanding of New Kingdom Egyptian scribal practice has deepened, but they remain foundational reference points for anyone working on the military history of the 18th dynasty. The hand count passages specifically were subjected to renewed scholarly attention in the second half of the 20th century as the study of New Kingdom military organization matured into a distinct subfield of Egyptology. Scholars engaged with questions that the inscriptions themselves do not answer. What precisely is included in the hand count category? Does it encompass all enemy dead on the field? Or only those killed in specific circumstances? Or some subset defined by criteria that the inscription does not specify? How does the hand count relate to the prisoner count? Are the two categories mutually exclusive, or could individuals appear in both? What was the relationship between the field accounting process and the temple inscription, and how much transformation did the numbers undergo between their initial recording in the Levant and their permanent inscription at Karnak? These questions have generated substantial scholarly discussion and produced some clarification, but no consensus on the points that remain most resistant to the available evidence. The Annals are rich in information about certain things and deeply silent about others, and the silences are not randomly distributed. They cluster around precisely the aspects of the practice that would be most illuminating. The location of the engagement near which the 410 hands were collected, the city of Megiddo at the northern edge of the plain of Sharon, commanding the pass through the Carmel mountain ridge that controlled movement between the coastal plain and the broad agricultural valley of Jezreel, was one of the most strategically consequential sites in the ancient Levant. It had been continuously inhabited since at least the 4th millennium BC, its position making it a node through which trade, armies, and administrative authority had been passing for longer than any surviving written record could document. It appears in Egyptian texts, in Assyrian administrative records, in the narrative literature of the Hebrew Bible, where a plain associated with it is described in the apocalyptic literature of the New Testament as the site of a final eschatological confrontation, and in Hellenistic geographical sources. Archaeologists have excavated it extensively since the early 20th century, first under the direction of scholars from the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, who worked the site from 1925 to 1939, and subsequently under Israeli and international teams who have continued and significantly extended that work. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Property known as Tel Megiddo, located in what is now northern Israel. The Bronze Age occupation levels at Tel Megiddo that correspond to the period of the 18th dynasty Egyptian campaigns are present in the stratigraphic record and have been the subject of extended analysis. The correspondence between specific destruction events visible in those levels and the events described in the Annals has been a persistent and unresolved question in the scholarship. Some archaeologists read a particular destruction stratum as consistent with the Egyptian campaign under Thutmose III. Others argue that the correspondence is insufficiently precise to support confident attribution, given the long history of violent disruption at the site and the limitations of the chronological frameworks available for Bronze Age Levantine archaeology. The debate continues without resolution. No physical evidence of the hand-counting procedure itself has been identified at the site, and this is not a surprising absence. The collection occurred on an open field outside the city, not within any structure. Organic material deposited on an open field in the Mediterranean climate of the Jezreel Valley does not survive 3,500 years of exposure, weathering, agricultural activity, and successive human habitation of the surrounding landscape, under any conditions that do not include deliberate preservation. The hands, whatever was done with them after the count, are gone from the physical record. The only record that persists is the number in the stone at Karnak. Thutmose III died in the 54th year of his reign, around 1425 BC, at an age that physical analysis of his mummy suggests was advanced relative to the typical life expectancy of his era. Estimates of his age at death range from 50 to 65 years, with the uncertainty reflecting the difficulties of precise age determination from skeletal material that has been significantly altered by the mummification process and by subsequent damage. He was interred in the Valley of the Kings, in the tomb designated by modern Egyptologists as number 34, a structure whose painted decoration and inscribed texts represent some of the finest surviving examples of New Kingdom funerary art. His mummy was not found in that tomb. It was discovered in 1881 AD as part of the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, a grouping of royal mummies that priests of the 21st dynasty had relocated, likely beginning in the 11th century BC, from their original tombs in the Valley of the Kings to a concealed communal burial in an effort to protect them from the organized tomb robbery that had been systematically depleting the valley's burials over the preceding generations. The mummy of Thutmose III, when it was unwrapped by Emil Bruges following its discovery, was found to have been severely damaged, ancient damage inflicted by the tomb robbers who had found it despite the priest's efforts, and the compounded deterioration of more than 2,000 years in conditions that had not been consistently protective. It now resides in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it has been since the late 19th century. His annals remained on the wall at Karnak, accumulating the records of 17 campaigns across the length of his reign, each campaign adding its tallies to the stone that faced the sanctuary of Amun. The hand-counting practice, documented in the Annals and depicted in the reliefs of Medinet Habu 3 centuries later, persisted through the reigns of his successors and into the 20th dynasty, present wherever the documentary and visual record is sufficient to reveal it. At Medinet Habu, the scene of accounting is positioned with deliberate prominence in the temple's overall program of military imagery adjacent to the image of Ramesses III in his chariot, as if the two acts, the act of war and the act of formally reckoning the war's toll, were understood as inseparable components of a single event. The king fights. The king proves what the fighting accomplished. The proof takes a specific form. The specific form requires a specific procedure. The procedure has a place in the record. The record faces the god. The men whose hands contributed to the number 410 are not remembered anywhere in the surviving record. They are not named. They do not appear as individuals in any document. The coalition that assembled at Megiddo against the Egyptian advance was led, according to the Annals, by the ruler of Kadesh, a city on the Orontes River, in the region that is now western Syria, and included the kings and governors of more than 300 Canaanite and Syrian city-states and territories. The ruler of Kadesh is referred to in the carved text by his title and his city rather than by his personal name. The soldiers who served the coalition, who marched to the plain of Jezreel under the authority of these rulers, and fell there in the engagement that the stone record documents, have no presence in any surviving text as individuals. They exist in the inscription only as constituents of counts, as a fraction of the 2,238 prisoners, as contributors to the 924 chariots, as part of the 2,038 horses, and as the 410. They became the 410 in the moment the collection was complete, and they have been the 410 ever since, preserved in that number, in that stone, in that temple, for approximately 3,500 years. The number has persisted longer than the religious tradition that produced it. It was carved when the Mycenaean palace culture was still active at Mycenae and Tiryns, centuries before those palaces collapsed in the widespread disruption of the Late Bronze Age. It was carved before the earliest texts of what would become the Hebrew Bible were committed to stable written form. It was carved before the founding of the city of Rome by more than 700 years, before the existence of the Greek philosophical tradition, before the construction of the Parthenon, before the military campaigns of Alexander of Macedon that remapped the world the Annals were written in, It has endured the conquest of Egypt by the Assyrians, by the Persians, by the Macedonians under Alexander, by the Romans, by the Arab armies of the 7th century AD, by the Ottoman Empire, by the forces of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798, by the British administration that governed Egypt from the late 19th century until the mid-20th. It has endured the establishment and dissolution of scholarly institutions, the development and revision of the academic field that reads and interprets it, and the footsteps of millions of visitors who have walked through the processional avenues and hypostyle halls of Karnak since the temple was opened to systematic public access in the 19th century. Most of those visitors have not known it was there. The Annals are not on the tourist path. They are interior, positioned in a space that requires a guide and a purpose to reach. The number sits in its column of hieroglyphs, in the quiet of the Ak menu, in the interior of the complex, facing the direction of the sanctuary, witnessed by scholars and by the stone itself. The carvers who cut it were working within an administrative tradition that had been accumulating procedural knowledge and institutional memory for more than 1,000 years before they took up their tools. The number they cut was, within their system, as routine as an entry in a grain ledger, as expected as a list of livestock moved between provincial storehouses. It was the outcome of a defined procedure, delivered by defined personnel through defined stages, received by a defined official, incorporated into a defined location within a building dedicated to a defined recipient. Everything about the process that produced it was established. Nothing about it required improvisation. And yet the object at the center of it, the right hand specifically, and not the left, and not any other anatomical object that would have served the same counting function without any loss of efficiency, was not a routine administrative choice. It was a choice made within a symbolic architecture in which the body's parts carried meaning, in which the right hand was the hand of action and agency, in which the removal of that hand from the body of a fallen enemy was not simply the extraction of a countable unit, but the permanent cancellation of the capacity it had expressed. The hand that had struck, the hand that had moved against the order of things, the hand that, removed from its body and counted by a scribe sitting at a deliberate remove from the pile, incorporated into a number written on field papyrus and then cut into limestone in the house of Ammon, could no longer reach into the world, could no longer disturb what it had been willing to disturb, could no longer threaten what the Pharaoh existed to protect. The inscription does not say any of this. The inscription records the number. That was enough. The rest was understood. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the records that outlasted the systems that produced them, to the numbers that survived every collapse and still sit quietly in stone, waiting, consider subscribing. There are many more accounts like this one. They have been waiting a very long time. They are not in any hurry.